Hi, welcome to After Dark Online. I'm Jennifer Frazier, one of the biologists at the Exploratorium. Thank you for joining us for tonight's special live event on the documentary film Human Nature. Human Nature tells a story of CRISPR, a powerful new biological tool that has made it possible to edit the DNA of almost every living thing. CRISPR is so revolutionary that Dr. Emmanuelle Charpentier and Dr. Jennifer Doudna were awarded this year's Nobel Prize for the development of this new method. The film Human Nature tells the story of CRISPR and not only explains vividly how CRISPR works, but how this technology is already being applied to very critical societal issues, from mitigating disease to dealing with the issues of climate change. The film also raises critical questions. Who will decide when and how this technology is applied, and how will we ensure that the benefits are applied equitably? The themes from Human Nature could not be more timely. As we're all acutely experiencing during the COVID-19 pandemic, science is not separate from society, but an integral part of it. Without thoughtful discussion and dialogue at all levels of society, the benefits of science cannot fully be realized. To discuss these important themes, we have three incredible guests who've been involved with the film. Professor Alta Charo and executive producers Elliot Kirschner and Dan Rather, whom I'll briefly introduce. Professor Alta Charo is professor of law and bioethics at the University of Wisconsin. She has served on panels around science policy at the highest levels, working with both Presidents Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, and co-chairing committees at the National Academy of Sciences on human embryonic stem cell research and human genome editing. Elliot Kirschner is an executive producer at the Wonder Collaborative, an innovative filmmaking organization that produced Human Nature. He is also a New York Times bestselling author and an Emmy Award-winning news and documentary producer who started at CBS News and 60 Minutes. Dan Rather is one of the world's most prominent journalists. He was the anchor and the managing editor of the CBS Evening News for 24 years. He has interviewed every living president since Eisenhower and has personally covered almost every important dateline for 60 years. Mr. Rather is currently CEO and president of News and Guts, an independent production company, and he was also an executive producer on Human Nature. So please join me in a warm welcome for all of our panelists. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having us.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Jen.
All right, well, I'm excited to get started, but before we begin the conversation, I just wanted to explain to everyone out there how we are going to run the show. And for the first half, we'll be having a conversation among the panelists about the film and some of these other themes. And then for the second half, we will transition into taking questions from you, the audience. And you may be wondering, how exactly can I ask a question here in my living room? And that is in the comments. So whether you're watching on YouTube or Facebook Live, there should be an area where you can make comments. And we have a team from the Exploratorium that will be looking in the comments. And in the second half of the show, we'll be pulling some of those questions here into this virtual space. So that's a little bit about how things will go. And we'll start from there. So my first question is actually for you, Mr. Rather. And as I think your bio makes clear, you are one of the most preeminent journalists who probably knows how to find a good story. And I'm wondering what drew you in particular to the story of CRISPR?
Well, first of all, basically the answer is curiosity. The journalists by nature are always asking one another, where is the big story? And with Elliot Kirschner, with whom I've worked for a long time, and I were discussing that one time, Elliot, among other things, we talked about it and said, well, there's this thing called CRISPR. I said, well, what the hell's that? And he sort of roughly outlined, he said, I'm hearing it's big. He didn't profess to fully understand it himself. So I said, well, let's look into it. He looked into it and came back to me. He said, Dan, this could be a really big story for all of the 21st century. So I went to California to interview Professor Doudna. And once I interviewed her, I walked out of that interview saying to Elliot, this could be the biggest story I've ever covered. Certainly, this is a story that will echo through the 21st century. We have to jump on it. I think I used some Texans, and we have to jump on it like a hawk on a rabbit and get all over it. That eventually led to the film.
Okay, I can't say I've ever heard the expression "hawk on a rabbit," but why did you think CRISPR was such a big story? I mean, what elements jumped out at you that made you think this was so important?
Well, first and foremost, the ability to engineer, if you will, DNA was mind blowing to me. That I don't have a strong background in science, but even I could see that the ramifications of it, both on the positive side and the negative side, I would say as much as anything, what drew me to it and actually almost got addicted to following the story and trying to do this film along with Elliot and the others was the belief that here's a story that is going to reverberate for the rest of the century. Big stories like a big hurricane or an earthquake or even a war, they have a time when they run and then go into the past. But this story's potential just to run. And then I was also very curious, how did the scientists come to this? How does it work? That's where the curiosity and the discovery, for me, if you will, came in. That we spent a lot of time trying to, at least I did, trying to learn what it is that scientists think they're doing, what process brings us to such a startling discovery as this. Also, I would say what I will call the dark side of CRISPR's potential, the ability of such things where we're not there at the moment, but the potential it does exist for so-called, quote, designer babies. That part of it has been overemphasized, and it's one of the things we try to put in context and give perspective in the film. But nonetheless, that whole dark side of the potential of CRISPR was an added reason to saying the public needs to have a discussion about this. The public needs to have a dialogue. We need to have a dialogue about this, about can it be controlled? If so, by whom? And all of those questions. So once we got into it, there were so many things that drew me to it. As I say, it became almost an addiction.
Well, that's what Professor Charo, I mean, well, there's a lot of questions I also have for you, Elliot, but I think right off the bat, Dan bringing up this whole, designer babies and a lot of the kind of quote unquote dark sides of CRISPR. I feel like you made a lot of really great statements in the film, especially about this history of sort of these fears repeating themselves. Do you want to sort of expand on that? Like because you've obviously had a lot of experience seeing technologies over and over again in the position that you've been in. So how is it that you situate CRISPR and some of the fears that have come up for people?
Well, I think the most important thing to start with is that CRISPR is a tool, and every tool presents what we call the dual use dilemma. It could be used for good, it could be used for bad. If you were to give somebody a knife or give somebody fire for the first time, you can imagine a whole array of potential uses, great benefit, and also some really tragic uses. So it is all about, as Dan Rather was saying, it is all about governance, how to capture what's good and prevent what's bad. And because CRISPR is not only powerful in terms of the ability to change DNA, but it also is something that is easier to do than previous genetic engineering techniques, so a wider range of people can use it. The laboratories don't have to be nearly as elaborate. It also, in a sense, democratizes the technology. And that means that there are more people who can do more things. Again, dual use, right? That's great, but it's also a little bit scary. And the uses range from the so-called designer baby, which is probably going to be the least frequent use, if ever, to the kind of somatic therapy that we imagine for people like David in the film with sickle cell. There's already one patient who's done well with it. To a wide variety of uses for animals and plants to make them easier to grow during climate change or more nutritious or whatever. And even more recently, we've seen how it could be used to speed up the development of new diagnostics in the context of the pandemic and lead us to vaccines. So the range of benefits is vast. And the question is then, at a national level and at a global level, how do you avoid giving power to rogues, civilian or scientists that are going to do things that are dangerous or unethical.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's, I think that kind of gets into this idea of dialogue, right? So Dan brought up dialogue and you're talking about governance. And I think, you know, that's a question that I actually was going to begin to ask Elliot that I think could relate to this question around policy and governance too. How do you see something like a film elevating awareness and dialogue, Elliot, you know, with something like CRISPR so that there can be more of a conversation across all of these different scales?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, film we know is a very powerful tool for communication, and it can be also a manipulative tool. I mean, there have been no shortage of it's yet another, to use Alta's reference, it's yet another tool. I mean, it was used by the Nazis, and it's been used by, Carl Sagan. I mean, it's like it can be. So we knew when we were doing this that, we had a powerful tool to use. We wanted to do a film that was both timely and a bit timeless, that we recognized that we were capturing a process of discovery almost in real time. This was before the Nobel Prize. This was before a lot of the discoveries. And, things were already pointing in that direction, as Alta said, about its uses, for therapeutics and such, but we weren't there yet, certainly when we started. And so one of the things we wanted to do, and we had to confront, was the question of, well, what's realistic? How much do we push it? How much, and this was a question that we really were constantly asking ourselves, and the scientists asked us, and the ethicists and all these different people were asking, yes, there are things that seem very, very distant, which we do address. And, are we making them seem more immediate than they are? Are we overhyping this? On the other hand, scientific discoveries, they occur at their own timeline, and they're very difficult to predict. Sometimes things, how long have we been in a quote unquote war on cancer? And until there's now been recent breakthroughs, but for a long time, it looked like we were stuck. On the other hand, CRISPR has moved very, very fast. In fact, we were finishing production when there was this, what happened in China where a Chinese scientist went in and edited, in vitro, and edited the germline of twin girls who were then subsequently born. And so that was an example where, when we were doing this, that seemed so far off that was years and years away that why are you contending with this? It's not going to happen. And yet it went ahead and happened. So we made the decision that we were trying to contextualize it. We said, listen, we're not going to overhype it. We're not going to say this is imminent. We're not going to say it's going to be easy to, engineer intelligence. What even is intelligence? We really sort of, on the other hand, we don't want to undersell how fast this could go. People need to be asking the questions now before it's feasible, because one of the things that we used as a yardstick for a measurement here was the internet, which crept up on us, and we just adopted wholesale, and it seemed like an unmitigated good. And now suddenly we're seeing, social media and all these things being used for divisions and spreading of propaganda and all of that. So we were thinking in constructing this film, we want to engage the public. We want to give them a sense of where we are right now, but also stretch this idea of uncertainty so that people can say, look, let's discuss this now before it's decided for us. Yeah.
And but I think, as you said, film I think it does a really good job of presenting some of the aspects of science. I thought the visuals you used to actually show CRISPR and how it works, were seeing it dynamically represented. That's an important part, whether that's actual dialogue, but someone really seeing and understanding, oh, this is how this works. And I think another element that, could help demystify science is I think it really powerfully shows scientists. And I think there is this element, and that's especially powerful in film, where people don't realize sometimes that there are scientists behind the scenes doing the work, and that they care, they have children, and they're worried, they're sitting in their living rooms also not talking to people, or, whatever it is about that humanity. I mean, do you think that that's another important aspect of film, is kind of sharing some of the things that people don't normally see?
What film does, it's a visual medium, and you realize how many cues you pick up visually when you talk to people. I think that's one of the interesting things about this pandemic, with all this video communication, and why we still gravitate to that as opposed to just an audio communication, because so much of the way we transmit information is subconsciously and through video and through visuals rather, and visual cues. And so, I think one of the things we try to do we didn't have any narration. We didn't want any sort of feel like there had to be a translator between the scientist or the speaker and the public. And we did these very, very long interviews. Adam Bolt, the director, and the editing team, and everybody did a wonderful job really conceiving of this. And we had sort of this idea that, well, people are going to speak directly to the audience. And in seeing how people, all the scientists there, none of them, no two sound the same, no two look the same, no two, and even though we didn't go home with them or spend, hours and hours in the film with their backstory, we hope people still got a sense of the diversity, of a sense that there's no such thing as a scientist, that they don't fit into a neat box. And that was really important to us. The other thing is, you mentioned about the graphics and the visuals. We really didn't want to, quote unquote, dumb it down, this film. And what was so amazing was we'd go into screen, and we didn't, we thought we really were pushing the envelope about how hard it could be and how complicated. And we'd go into, these screenings for general audiences, and people would come up to me and say, thank you for making it really simple. I'm not good at science, and, you really dumbed it down to my level. And I'm like, all right, there's a disconnect. And it made you realize that there's something missing in the way we're teaching people, because we were, I think, transmitting a very sophisticated sense of CRISPR, but yet in a way that people who didn't feel a backing felt that they could absorb. And another thing that's been really thrilling in seeing it, it's available now on Netflix, and it was on Nova. A lot of people are writing that they're watching this film multiple times, which for us is really quite rewarding. Even early on, Adam Bolt, the director, said, I would love to make a documentary that people watch more than once. He loves documentaries. He doesn't watch many more than once. And I think that part of this was a sense that there was so much in there that people felt, I can still learn and experience it differently. And I think that's a combination of both hearing from the scientists and the other participants in the film and sort of picking up on their personalities and cues, and also the educational aspects and the graphics, the sense that we can transmit a sophisticated understanding.
Yeah, well, I think, I just follow up with Dan, having worked in so many formats, obviously like short news segments, like feature news segments, roles in film. What do you see as the power of a longer format of something like film for communicating what you said? I thought your metaphor of a tornado or a war, right? Like, this is not a short-term, one-time event. So how is it that you think something like film can really communicate the scope or arc of a story like CRISPR?
Well, one of the things is film, particularly a well-made documentary. And frankly, Elliot Kirschner, who's here, deserves the most credit for this film, because he wasn't in any way the red beating heart of the film. But in answer to your question, that film allows you to deal with depth. For example, television, where I've spent part of my life, the biggest part of my life, has many advantages, tremendous advantages to television, including it can take you there, kind of the proverbial magic carpet. But television has difficulty with depth and such things as context and perspective. That television is very difficult to give those things to folks. In film, you can go into depth, but when you're dealing with something as complicated as CRISPR, and at the same time as important as CRISPR, the challenge, when it comes to the depth, having said that's one of the big advantages it has, is on the one hand, and this was the challenge of making Human Nature, we wanted to do a film that the scientists would say, when they saw it, they got it right. Yeah, they got it right. And at the same time, the non-scientists who saw the film could say, I understand it. They speak a language, they spoke a language in the film that I can understand. And in both cases, it deals with film's strength of giving depth. Film's additional strength is, quite frankly, it's of all the media, it gives you the best opportunity to focus and remain focused. We all know in television, on your average television program, a half hour is forever. And with film, it has this ability on a big screen to keep people focused and to give them depth. I would say those are the two biggest advantages to it. There's one other point, if you don't mind my...
Oh, of course.
...wanted to make, and it goes back to something that Professor Charo said coming in, and that is that, journalists, in the end, we want to do something that counts. We want to do something that matters. And we knew that this film really could be something that matters. And something that stood the test of time. But in doing the film, we were also aware that when people talk about breakthroughs in science, or for that matter, in almost anything, that the time frame usually moves faster than people think it will do. When we talk about, well, we have a lot of time with CRISPR, it's going to take time to do this and time to do this. Keep in mind that usually once we have a scientific breakthrough, the development of that breakthrough goes faster than most people believe. And I just wanted to make sure we emphasize tonight that we have time to have a dialogue about this CRISPR, but time is running on us. And the quick example I use, when the Wright brothers broke through with the flight, the best journalists of that time, at the beginning of the 20th century, said, you know what, in 25 to 50 years, airplanes may be able to fly coast to coast. Well, in less than 10 years, they were flying coast to coast. In fewer than, I think, 25 or 30 years, they were flying transcontinental. So that's an example of how when you have a breakthrough, it moves much faster. And I think that will be the case with CRISPR. It's going to move very fast, which is the reason we need to have a conversation now about what.
And that was one of the things thank you so much, Mr. Rather. And I think that was a point that even in some conversations earlier with Professor Charo, you gave the perfect segue to something I think she really had emphasized, is that even since this film came out, which is fairly recent, a lot has already happened with CRISPR. So, I mean, to build on what Mr. Rather just said, Professor Charo, do you want to talk about even some of the advances that have happened or some of the developments that have happened with CRISPR? And then we can circle around to like the dialogue that we need to have.
Sure, I'm happy to, because the number of potential applications has exploded. Some will move quickly from a scientific point of view, but they may not get to the public right away because they are medical products that need to go through an approval process. But we've already had clinical trials for several different forms of blindness. So we're seeing more kinds of therapies, as well as some cancer-related therapies that are already now in testing on human beings. We've also seen its use in an agricultural setting. So there are diseases that are transmitted by insects, for example, dengue fever or yellow fever that's transmitted by mosquitoes. And now we're looking at tools to be able to actually change mosquitoes in a way that prevents them from carrying the dengue fever or the yellow fever. And this would be one way of stamping out that disease in places where it's really taking an enormous toll. It's also something that can be used for something called epigenetics. And this really wasn't talked about in the film. Instead of actually changing the DNA sequence, what you do is you change those things that decide whether the DNA is going to express itself genetically in a strong or weak way. I mean, think about a piano and think of your genes as like a bunch of chords that you play on the piano. But there are those pedals beneath, and the pedals decide whether or not it's going to come out loud or soft. Epigenetics gives us a chance to maybe change how strongly a gene expresses, but it's not permanent. It doesn't change you permanently. It's reversible, and it doesn't pass to your children. So it takes away some of the risks and some of the concerns, but leaves us with new opportunities. A lot of interest in looking at that potential application as well. So It's exploding.
Yeah, no, and that actually, I mean, I think some of the things we've been doing a show, we're starting to develop an exhibition in our museum on plants. And the role of CRISPR in agriculture is profound. And especially if we think of things like making crops that can stand up to the climate changes coming, that's really interesting. But I was really interested in the theme of dialogue and realized that I'm sitting here really enjoying our conversation and realizing we can start having a dialogue with the public by taking their questions. So it's actually, if everyone is ready to, this conversation can continue with some of the questions that we have from the public, if our team wants to pull some of those up. And in the meantime, I do think, Alta, do you feel like you're seeing some more dialogue? The film's helped you even in some of your policy conversations?
It's expanded the number of people who understand the technology a lot better. I get a lot of emails from people who've seen it. And there are conversations going on in countries all around the world. There are national policy bodies and ethics bodies that are meeting to decide what will be permitted and what not, or how much they should support it, or how they distribute it fairly to everybody. And the film has been watched by many of the people that are in those rooms making those decisions.
Fantastic. Well, that's good to know. And I see, so here is a question coming from Al and Linda Lerner. Well, I'm guessing it might be one of them, but I'm not sure who. Could CRISPR be an effective way to fight COVID, change a receptive gene, or create a vaccine? Now, Professor Charo, I know we were actually talking about this a little bit before the show. Would you mind taking a stab at addressing this question?
Yeah, keeping in mind, I am not a biologist, right? Jen is the biologist.
I can chime in. Yes, I can chime in.
I actually asked this question very early on to another person who appeared in the film, David Baltimore, and I sent him a note saying, wouldn't it be possible to edit the cells in the lungs so that they would be resistant to this virus, right? You should be able to do that. And he said, yes, in theory, but it's so inefficient. There are so many cells in your lungs, you couldn't edit them all. So that's not going to be the best way to do this. It has been helpful, though, in being able to decode the virus and all of its variants. Now, California is suffering now from a particularly contagious variant. And that helps to lead to an ability to both create better diagnostics and also to be able to confirm vaccines that can or cannot actually work effectively against the new variants. So it's indirectly very, very helpful, but not as a direct therapy yet.
Yeah, and Elliot, I didn't know if you had something to add, because I know I've seen you do some interviews with Dr. Doudna since the pandemic started, and if you had anything else to add about the role of CRISPR. I think Professor Charo put it well, that it's being used.
I think it's been mostly used at this point for testing. There's been some testing that's been using it. I mean, where it's really, it's really being used in a lot of other applications. I mean, another thing that's people are becoming very aware of is immunotherapy for cancer, and that's a case where that's probably going to be very useful, as well as some other disease treatments. But I think the COVID, it's pretty. I mean, I think
no. That's what we'll know. So on this question, I mean, I do think my understanding is that it's difficult to use in a direct way. Like, it's not going to become the therapeutic, but I know like the Dan Fletcher's lab at Berkeley has been, there are many, many labs that are using it for different forms of screening. And again, I think to Professor Charo's and the film's point, it's a tool that's accelerating research. It's accelerating research to help us combat the pandemic, even if it's not the treatment itself. But let's jump to the next question from our audience. And they haven't confirmed it's more contagious yet, but it likely is, just so that no one's totally panicking yet. Part of research. No, don't worry. The research, I think I emailed a lot of people on Monday. It's like the variant it's likely because it's more common, but they're doing the lab studies. But don't worry, I'm sure it probably is more contagious. All right, this is from Josh Flanders. The film seems to focus primarily on medical ethicists and bioethicists. Did you speak to philosophical ethicists as well? It seems bringing non-medical perspectives about the ethics of this powerful discovery is important. And I guess, Professor Charo, I'll let you start with that, as you are the bioethicist.
So my background is in law. Hank Greeley was also interviewed. He's also got a background in law. He and I, of course, have both worked for a long time in the medical context, but I don't recall that there was anybody who was a card-carrying philosopher who was interviewed. But for what it's worth, Hank and I have spent a tremendous amount of time being educated by philosophers. So we are bad lay philosophers for your service.
No, that's a great question, though. Elliot, do you have some thoughts on that? Because it brings some interesting issues up.
I think that there's, one of the things that the biggest set of criticisms of the film, and they're fair in their way, is what we didn't include. There's a lot we didn't deal with. We didn't really deal with agriculture. We didn't go into a lot of the history of recombinant DNA, and so one of the real struggles, and this is something that Dan had mentioned about sort of like, we knew we didn't want to just do a sort of a short TV, we wanted to do a feature length film, but this is such a topic that you could have done a whole mini series on it. And so the question is, well, why not a mini series? Then you could get into some of these other issues, and it could stretch into a lot of different episodes. And one of the things that we really wanted to do was have this be something where people could gather to watch. Now, unfortunately, we had a big theatrical rollout that was scheduled for early March 2019, and sort of timing really, scuttled all of that. But the thought was, if we made a feature-length film, it's something that people could sit down and watch together in one sitting. And as such, that we had to make choices about how many different ways we could go. And one of the things we wanted to do was have voices wrestle with it from multiple perspectives. And so something early on that we saw was that the scientists were themselves confronting the ethics of it. That they weren't just, well, here's the scientist, here's the ethicist, here's patients. Everybody was confronting it. And so we really tried to find core voices, because there's a lot of voices already in this film, that allowed us to approach this story from multiple angles, and that were participants in the actual dialogue. That they were either researchers, or somebody like Alta who's been, a leader in sort of the policy issues and determining that. And so we wanted that. So I think that's, rather than find more individual single topic people that would weigh in, we wanted to have participants. And unfortunately, there just was a limit to how many different perspectives we could put, or what kind of information we could put in what was going to be essentially a 90-minute film.
Yeah, editorial decisions. But I do think that's of interest. And, I would refer people who are interested in things about the relationship between philosophy and science. The American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS, does have a division, the acronym, and I apologize on the fly, I can't remember, it's DOSER, DOSER, and they have all sorts of dialogues on religion, ethics, and science. They really try to promote conversation. So just as an aside for the person who asked. Yeah, sorry, Elliot.
No, I want to just jump in. And sorry, what we really hoped to do was that we would pair this film with conversations from voices that we couldn't put in it. And so we expected to screen it and have philosophers or theologians or other people that were approaching the subject from a broader sort of different point of view. And so the idea would be we would sit and watch the film. We hope to keep doing this. The people would watch the film, and then they'd have a discussion, but you'd have a common set of knowledge that the people would have, but then the discussion could take it into these issues like Josh is bringing up, and really, have philosophers debate. And I think that would be a fascinating compendium of programming to go with the film. So it is our hope that people can use the film to program around it, to bring other voices in there that we didn't get to put into the film.
Yeah, Josh will be tapping you for helping us program the next philosophical CRISPR program. No, thank you for that great question. I think we're ready for the next question. Herb Masters posting, and I think I know this person. Herb Masters, hello. Does this offer an answer to malaria? Is there a connection between sickle cell and malaria that makes this possible? I don't know which one of you. I know there was some, especially because of David.
Yeah.
If one of you wants to take a stab at this one.
I wouldn't. I don't know. I don't feel.
When you interviewed Matt in his Stanford office, he talked about the dilemma here that sickle cell disease, which is a terrible chronic disease, occurs when you have two copies of the variant. And if you have one copy of the variant, you don't actually have sickle cell disease, but it does give you some additional resistance to malaria. And this probably explains why this particular variant is found so frequently in West Africa, because of generations of people who survived malaria because they had the variant. So one of the concerns that's frequently raised is that if this is used in a hereditary fashion, would we accidentally remove a variant from the human population that has some value in another context? The response usually is that we're not likely to be able to do it in a reproductive context to enough people to really make a dent in the global frequency. But it is a cautionary tale about saying a variant is bad without really understanding all of its functions. What would be nice is if, like with dengue fever and yellow fever, if instead this was the avenue to genetic engineering of the insects that carry malaria and give us another way to help prevent people from becoming infected. As opposed to changing the people, you change the environment.
Yeah, and I would say, just as an add-on to that, Herb, your question, I think my understanding is that CRISPR is being used primarily with the vectors, the insects, because you could engineer insects and then they could take over that population, and then you would no longer be having, that there would not be the disease spreading. But, I think to Professor Charo's point, it would be very difficult. There is an advantage to the sickle cell gene, and there is really no such thing as like a bad gene necessarily. That's just the way we label them. And I do think, that there is the word, it would be very hard on an individual level to like shape the direction of human evolution with CRISPR right away. But yeah, let's go to the next question. Anita Lilly, how do we weigh the risks of using CRISPR to get rid of something bad, like dengue fever? How do we try to anticipate the unintended consequences of a change like that?
Well, first of all, we can start by having a dialogue, and to understand that the quicker we get to having a true national dialogue, for that matter, an international dialogue on this, on this very subject, the better it's going to be for all of us. Because while I'm not a scientist and I joke, or it's not really a joke, I don't know that much about science. I do know this, that as in so many other things, the thought once thought cannot be unthought, which is to say, once we learned how to make a nuclear weapon, there was no way to say, that's so dangerous to the world, we just have to put it back in the bottle, if you will, and bury it and forget it. You can't do that. And we couldn't do that with the internet. Again, once it was developed, there it was. With the internet, we didn't have a discussion in the early stages about what the medium and long range consequences could be. Here with CRISPR, we have that opportunity. There's no turning back. So we have to move quickly. And the dialogue absolutely has to include the public at large, never mind philosophers and theologians, but everybody has to be involved. So as much as anything, our film, Human Nature, was a signal to everybody. This is here. You can't go back from it. You look at the dark side of it and you may say, I wish they just forget the whole thing. There's no doing that. The question is, how are we going to deal with it?
If I may just very briefly and very quickly.
Yes.
Because the question referred specifically to things like dengue fever. One way you can actually manage risks is to build in some kind of way to control a problem if it emerges. So with so-called gene drives, where you're going to move a change in an insect population through that population as quickly as possible in order to change the insects, they can't pass on dengue fever. You can also anticipate that this might get out of control and you don't want so many insects to be changed. So you build in a mechanism by which you can shut down the change. And the insects will revert, or the ones that have been changed will die. And there's several mechanisms that have already been developed to do exactly that. So one way of responding is anticipate problems and then design a solution or a mitigation factor into the technology from the beginning.
I mean, I think that what is also added, and I think as Dan mentioned about, why the dialogue has to happen is that this is not a binary question really between good and bad. I mean, that there are things that are on the extremes, and this is something we try to really handle in the film, that okay, you get rid of Huntington's disease. That seems obvious if we can. We're not going to, engineer people to have longer eyelashes or something like that, or, that's something, but, like what about these things that where you start getting into, is this sort of diversity or is it deficit? How do we consider and the sort of humility that that we don't know what we might select, what kind of traits we might want in the future. I mean, I sort of use this analogy. I mean, especially here in the Bay Area with the Golden State Warriors. I mean, that they created a version of basketball and a typical basketball player and a star that was very different than what the New York Knicks were in the 1980s. And so, like, if you were saying, we want to engineer an NBA superstar, well, you would maybe choose to do different traits depending on how the game's evolved. And I think that, that society changes, that, what is perfect, what's preferable, and so when you start getting questions like, do you engineer out Asperger's syndrome? What about, attention deficit disorder or things like that if you can, but maybe they, what are the unintended consequences of things that are complicated, or is deafness or something like that, is that a deficit, or is that something that's its own culture? And so these are, I think, becomes really, really complicated questions, which and they are the questions that, as Dan says, that everybody needs to address, because people are living with this. People live within the margins and the gray areas of life, and the definitions that we're all defined in so many different ways. And so if we start engineering that, if we start trying to do that, especially in sort of for good in the germline, it raises a lot of really questions, and we must have we should have recognized with our own the dangers of hubris to think that we would even know, even if we could say we knew what the unintended consequences were, we don't know whether the changes we make are ones that we would want to make, and what
Oh, all right. Oh, wow. Another question about, Elliot, I wasn't sure if you might have frozen for a second, or maybe you were just pondering. You're pondering deeply. All right. No, and thank you for that question, Anita, and hello to Anita. So we have a whole exploratorium network out there. All right. So I apologies in advance if I mispronounce the name, but I think it is Mefis Tofel World Music Television. And maybe the World Music Television is not part of your birth certificate, or maybe it is. How accessible can this technology be to do-it-yourself biology, and how dangerous can it be?
It is already being used by undergraduates, and I predict it'll be used by high school students soon. If it not, it might actually be already. There are international competitions for young students in genetic engineering that are run every year, and some of those students are already using this technique. How dangerous can it be? That's hard to evaluate. Most things that you might think of as dangerous that might get released into the environment they'll die because they can't compete against the overwhelming abundance of the natural environment. But could somebody do something seriously scary? Yeah. One of the real concerns has to do with bioweapons and whether this would add to the already substantial number of ways people can develop biological weapons. And that's an active area of conversation in our government and many others about how to stop that from happening.
So that is something, just so that people aren't leaving here going oh my God, on top of the contagious variant, now there's some CRISPR bioweapons being developed in a garage by a high school student. Isn't that one? Well, maybe, no, I hope not. No.
Not only would it be beyond a high school student to do that, but also it turns out the delivery system is a big obstacle. So people should still be able to sleep tonight.
Yes. Okay, good.
But there's a lot of preemptive activity to make sure that the technology does not get diverted to nefarious uses.
Right. And I'm guessing that, some of the panels, and this even related to the previous question, and I think one of the big themes that we've seen with science over the last year is, advisory committees such as those, Professor Charo has served on. There are advisory committees that advise the government that do think carefully and make really strong recommendations, right? They talk to all the scientists, they look at the science, they try to predict what the consequences will be, whether it's someone working with CRISPR in their garage or what's going to happen with a mosquito who's altered, so that they can anticipate as many of these risks and weigh the costs and benefits, and then do make recommendations to the government. And, I think back to that point of dialogue, that's why it's really important to have a government, a dialogue going where the government's curious about science and willing to implement some of the different recommendations. So that's just to reassure people a bit that there are these huge panels that Professor Charo served on many, many times, where they are considering all of these things and then put in all kinds of different safeguards and regulations to hopefully mitigate the risk. So anyway, that's just a little add on there. But next question, Sam Sharkland. What are examples of a dangerous technology being handled appropriately in public discourse and applications, as opposed to the atomic bomb example? So, yeah, a dangerous technology being handled appropriately. Well, I would, as opposed to an atomic bomb, I guess I thought of as an atomic bomb as dangerous, but.
Good question.
Yeah, Dan, yeah. Dan, do you want to take a stab at that, or Elliot?
I can't think of anything at the moment, but I'm dog paddling here to give Elliot a little time to think. Maybe he can come up with something.
Well, I think this goes to This goes to Alta's point about tools. I mean, in a way that, I mean, there are technologies that have the potential to be incredibly dangerous. I mean, you could use automobiles to be weapons of mass murder. I mean, we see that sometimes that has happened in a what do you call it, in terrorist attacks where people will drive into the crowd. I mean, you could imagine that being a time, every time somebody drives down Fifth Avenue, New York, you could potentially use this technology, a dangerous technology, to kill hundreds of people, and it's not used that way. There's others. I think what it does show is that most people are also not malicious. That most people don't want to cause great harm to the world or to others, and so. Not to say that isn't, so that we find dangers, that we need to, a lot of what we see is that, we need to survey. It's about finding the actors who are willing to use a technology in a dangerous way. I think that, airplanes could be a dangerous technology. I mean, all these things could be dangerous, really. And I think that we find ways to make them safe, to regulate, to train people, to find safety features. We've made cars a lot safer. We put airbags in them.
But I'm sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, no, I don't know.
There are other examples too of governance where it's not. So Elliot's talking about ways you can actually make the technology safer by design, which is the first place to start. But we have a biological weapons convention. We have a chemical weapons convention that countries have signed on to. We have tremendous capacity for weaponizing a lot of substances that we use in our laboratories or even use in our kitchens. And countries got together and signed those. And now we have mutual agreements for inspection of facilities and to monitor the movement of the basic materials that would be needed to create these weapons in order to identify any emerging threats, particularly from so-called non-state actors, right, like a terrorist. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. It's a balance of, do you want to give up all of the benefits of biology and chemistry in order to avoid this low probability but high consequence problem of a weapon? And if you don't want to give up all the benefits, you figure out how to minimize the risk of the weapon. But those are two examples where governance has come into play.
And maybe I would ask a question for Dan. When you were, sort of considering your life and the echoes of World War I. I mean, and other future conflicts that you covered.
World War I.
Well, he didn't cover. You didn't cover World War I. But
I was like, wait a minute.
But I'm saying World War I saw extensive use of chemical weapons, and was there the expectation in future conflicts? World War II, Korea, Vietnam, others. That to Alta's point is that we haven't, right? I mean, we haven't seen those used.
Well, that is true, and that this is a very good point. For example, in World War I, mustard gas was used. It was devastating chemical warfare. And as Professor Charo has pointed out, as a result of that, this is just one example, that there was international safety valves, if you will, put in place. Everybody realizing there's nothing perfect. So by the time that record shows that even I was not covering World War I.
Yes.
I didn't suggest.
But in combat zone after war zone that I have covered ever since I was born in 1931, but in battlefields now, that there's not a lot of worry about somebody using mustard gas or, for that matter, any other gas. There's always the realization that some character out of bounds could do so. But my point being, there were safeguards put in place that everybody agreed, listen, mustard gas is so terrible as a result of what was learned in World War I. We can't see that happening again. We just can't have that happening again. And it took some time, but slowly real safeguards, what I would call rails were put in place to safeguard against the use of gas, and they've worked. And in every war zone I've been in since then, and I have been in quite a few, to say, one thing the commanders don't worry about is an attack of mustard gas or anything anywhere close to it. Yet, there's always somewhere in the back of their head that somebody could break through and break the rules. So we have to always emphasize there's nothing perfect. It also occurs to me that if you want to go back, in its day, all those thousands of years ago, fire was a new technology. When fire was first discovered, somebody said, well, we better put some rules into place to how we try to use this, or otherwise, we can go around burning people. So I don't think it's too much to say that. I thought the automobiles that you mentioned, gun control, which is a whole another controversial subject, but nonetheless, there are some gun controls on guns. In other words, you cannot own a 105 millimeter howitzer. You can't own a large piece of artillery, and if you try to do it, there's law enforcement that keeps you from doing it. But that's not to say that this is always possible with something that a breakthrough as broad and deep as CRISPR. But we have, again, back to the fundamental point, we have to start talking about it now, because we fully realize that we need to come together internationally with some agreement on how we're going to handle this going forward, to de-emphasize and control as best we can what I call the dark side, and to emphasize the positive side and move forward.
No, and I think that's a good, before we transition to the next question, I mean, I think, again, some of these questions have gone a little toward the, like, what about the atomic bomb or war? I mean, yes, fire, cars. I mean, tragically, we've even seen airplanes. You can, anything, any tool or device can be used for ill will. And I think that's something Professor Charo emphasizes in the film. If humans want to do something bad, they will find a way to do it. And I think the one important consideration here is a lot of the things to have this dialogue, because if you just say, well, we won't use this tool, then you're not going to have accelerated COVID cures. You're not going to have treatments for sickle cell. You're not going to have crops that can survive the changes in climate. So I think, again, it's this making sure we balance the consequences and possible mitigate risks while trying to take advantage of the benefits. But we're actually I think it's time for the last question. So let's pull up the last question. Oh. All right. Yeah, to end after some things about atomic bombs. Again, apologies for pronunciation. El Rulo. Favorite CRISPR-inspired Hollywood film? Would you go to Jurassic Park? Okay, anyone can.
Well, I might jump. I mean, so interestingly, obviously, as Jurassic Park came out before there was CRISPR, and I think it really shows that this idea. I mean, what CRISPR was a way to do something that people thought would be done, could be done, should be done, were scared of being done anyway. And so that, and I think it's really important to and all the scientists will tell you this, the reason why we can use CRISPR to edit genomes in essentially all organisms is not just because of the CRISPR research, but because of many, many different strands of research that had taken place that really, they were waiting for this final piece to be able to do a targeted edit. But there was a lot of other things that had to go into place to allow this to happen. And I think that when you look at sort of science fiction, you get the sense that this idea of tinkering with nature and tinkering with genes is something that has sort of been in people's minds as soon as they realized what these were and what could be done. So I don't know whether Jurassic Park wouldn't necessarily be a CRISPR film. I think but I also think that what's interesting is that you see the balance here. You see the balance of fear over hope around these kind of new technologies. I mean, you're not seeing a bunch of films being made about how CRISPR suddenly is, feeding the world or protecting us against climate change. And I think that it might suggest that humans maybe are wired to overestimate the risk and maybe underestimate the positives. And I would love to see someone make a CRISPR film about what this technology could do in a positive way, or how it could change the world in ways that were not as really scary, but whereas imaginative in a more creative, positive way as they are in a negative way. So maybe the best CRISPR movie has yet to be made.
Well, and actually, I think we do. I'm realizing, so we do have, since that was a fun and good question, and actually now I'm thinking of all kinds of movies like Gattaca, but I think we do have time for one last question if our team wants to pull one up. Although now we could have a whole list of films, as I thought you guys did a great job of that, like Gattaca, Brave New World. All right, Sam Sharkland, what are the largest obstacles in communicating science to the general population when it's this important for a shared understanding? That's a great question, given even what we're seeing in these questions tonight. How do we really communicate something that already is probably impacting our lives? I don't know if, Dan, you want to start, since we've been answering lots of biology questions?
Well, certainly, I think that one of the largest obstacles in communicating science to the general population is the lack of enough education, particularly in the lower grades. How science is introduced to young students, how science is taught, is one obstacle. Mind you, I'm from a family, both my brother and sister are teachers, and I'm not jumping on teachers, but I think in answer to the question that comes to mind, perhaps even greater than that, is the general public, and this is people long since out of school, remain afraid of science in many ways and are just kind of turned off. How often have I heard people say, well, I can't get into science because they don't speak a language I understand. This is a common complaint. And the belief of the majority of the population that somehow scientists don't speak their language, that the language of science is either High Norse or Swahili or something so foreign that there's no sense getting into it. Somehow, some way, and I do think that film, and yes, a film such as Human Nature, can help bridge that, to have people understand, listen, there is a way, if you pay attention, there's a way to understand what scientists do, what they think they're trying to do, and how they do it. It starts with the dialogue, and we really haven't had a dialogue about science. And I will use this question to springboard very briefly to say that we've gone through a period the last 4 years where the top leadership of the country has repeatedly been anti-science. We can't afford to go through another 4-year period of that. It's dangerous to our survival as a country, as a society, as we know it. And I think there has to be some recognition of that when we talk about communicating science to the general public. That's one of the things that I think a lot of us need to spend some time trying to communicate to people, that this idea of being anti-science in the top leadership of the country is indeed putting the country in peril.
There's one thing that happened just in the last week that's worth noting. The new administration has named a biologist as the president's science advisor. That's the first time ever. They've always been physicists. And in addition, they've created a new division within the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House, never before, called Science and Society, and is being led by a prominent social scientist. So I think we are seeing now, even in the highest levels of government, a recognition of how important it is to treat science as part of the fabric of the country's life and not just as some separate endeavor that takes place hidden behind laboratory doors.
I know, Elliot, would you want to add something? I mean, again, as someone who spends their life communicating science.
Yeah, I think that there's a perception that science is a niche, and instead of it being central to so many aspects of modern life, whether it's the economy or technology or health and all of that. And I think it's covered as a niche. I think funding funding is a huge issue about an obstacle to communicating it is who's paying to support science communication? Where is that coming from? Who's distributing it? I think that these are, whether it's filmmaking or museums. I think that a lot of this that we really see. There's of the top museums that people flock to. Many of them are science museums. People, once people are engaged in it, you see the fear drift away. You see people, watching our films over and over, not just ours, others, so I think that there's just a conventional wisdom that is a chilling effect on science communication. That everybody's part of this. The science communicators feel like they're not doing it right, or that they have to sort of dumb it down for the general audience. The general audience feels like, well, I'm sort of scared by science. The distributors are like, well, science is not going to get a mass audience. And, The people that fund the science research don't necessarily also fund science communication. I think that other countries do that differently and put that part of it. So I think that there just has to be a reframing. And I take Alta's point about, about this administration and Dan's point. I mean, that science just has to be front and center. And I think when people start talking about it and listening to it, and some of that fear breaks away, and that we can change the idea that, as I said, it's not a niche. It's not like this foreign language, as Dan suggests people feel, and I think he's absolutely right about that. That scientists are part of the general public. They are human beings, and this is one of the greatest endeavors of the human mind. It's really about going beyond horizons and the accrual of knowledge and solving problems. And I think when you tell those stories and people can connect to them, that they don't even realize, well, that was science. And so I remain very, very optimistic. Nothing that I have seen suggests that this is hopeless. Quite the contrary. I think if there's a will to put science communication and there's the support for it front and center, that we could really be all very pleased and surprised by the results.
Well, and I think, this is a nice way to end, and in some ways, kind of brings it back home to, I'm not literally at the Exploratorium right now, as is obvious, but one of the things I hope all of those who have visited us before and who we can't wait to welcome back, I think it's also knowing that, of course, right now, so many of us are blown away that we have a vaccine within a year, or we think of these iconic science things, right? Development of a vaccine or something like CRISPR or a moon landing. And of course, those are like tremendous scientific achievements. But I think to Dan's point, we all start as scientists. Science isn't just in a test tube. It's not just with microscopes. It's not kind of these words and jargon that can be off-putting. Really, the ability to ask great questions and to notice is foundational to science. And I think the more that we all realize we actually inherently are all, maybe we're not doing the scientific method, but noticing, observing, being critical thinkers, looking at evidence, just these really fundamental skills of science. They don't just have to be for scientists. They can be something that benefit all of us. And I hope that this administration and all of us are supportive of efforts to encourage keep science education robust and keep museums, these things looking at sand and bubbles and having these conversations. They're all part of this broad, diverse spectrum of science communication and education and programs like this. So I know now we're already at time. I'm like, well, especially science communication, I could talk all night and learn so much more, but especially Professor Charo and Mr. Rather are on different time zones. And so I want to thank all of the panelists profoundly for their time spent on this and on a film to really help engage the public in a dialogue around an important topic. So you can hear the applause out there throughout the Bay Area. But thank you so much for being here. And I also want to make sure I thank there is a team behind the scenes, not with me in my living room because we're staying apart, but at the Exploratorium, Sam Sharklin, Kathleen McGuire, Cale Hazard, and Seywan Barrera, many others. So thank you to the team for being behind the scenes. And thank you all who tuned in. I know there's a lot going on and there's been a lot to think about this week, but thinking about, the role of science in our lives and engaging in the science that's going on and coming is really important. And we appreciate you taking the time to tune in. So thank you so much to our guests. And thank you to all of you out there. We can't wait to welcome you back to the museum. All right. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.